solution to the Bible's revelation on future things, which are also called last things. We have considered amillennialism, which who would like to give what is amillennialism? From someone other than Jerry. Well, that's right. So the awe is a little bit uh, of a misnomer. There is a millennium, but when is the millennium? Now is the millennium. Where is the millennium? Y- yeah, all right. So the millennium is when, if you remember, it is the reign of Christ for the 1,000 years, right? The reign of Christ and amillennialism is Christ's reign in the believers. Now, there's some distinctions. Is it the believers who are with Christ in heaven? Some of the amillennialists would say that. Others would say that it's his reign and all the saints on earth and in heaven, right? But that would say, where is the reign? When is the reign? And what is the nature of that reign? It is a spiritual. It is a spiritual reign of Christ, right? Millennialism. So this was our uh, incredibly sophisticated chart or diagram to illustrate millennialism. And so the events, when did the millennial reign of Christ occur or begin in millennialism? The first advent, the first advent. Now, you could ask them in particular, like, okay, exactly when did it start? Some may say maybe it was after Jesus came out of the wilderness, maybe at his resurrection. All right, but that it would be about the only kind of debate that all millennialists would have about the beginning. But is in the first advent, and it will continue through until the second advent. And then it ceases. And then with the new heavens and the new earth or the eternal state, those will be synonymous. There is now a change. So the present age is the age of Christ's reign in the saints from heaven in a spiritual way in amillennialism that will come to an end when the new heavens and the new earth happens after the final judgment. Millennialism. So we don't have a chart to review, but what was post millennialism? No, I didn't do pre-mill. They're saving the best for last.
Post-mill, oh yeah, here it is. They believe that Christ will come after a long period when Christianity is the dominant religion worldwide.
That is right. So where will Christ reign in post-millennialism?
It'll be after.
Where?
Oh, it'll be here on heaven.
That's right. Here on earth. So post-millennialism, different from amillennialism, Christ's reign is on earth. But where is Christ reigning in post-millennialism? Is Christ on earth reigning in post-millennialism? No, he is not. He is in heaven. So who then brings the millennium to earth in post-millennialism?
Oh, we do.
That's right. The church and the gospel's advance throughout the nations brings the millennium in post-millennialism. What is the nature of the millennial reign in post-millennialism? So it's on earth, so we could say in that sense it's earthly, as opposed to amillennialism, which was spiritual. It is among the nations, all of them, so it is political. It, but is it exhaustive? When you look at the, as we'll see, the interpretation that all systems or eschatologies have to deal with, Revelation 20, and we deal with this resurrection that is described of the saints who reign with Christ for 1,000 years. In postmillennialism, that resurrection is spiritual life. It's not literal resurrection. And so in that sense, they have to make something less than a total, exhaustive, reign of peace and righteousness over the earth. So it's a very different view, if you remember, of what premillennialism will have when it thinks of the nature of this earthly, political, physical reign of Christ on the earth when compared with the reign of the, so to speak, the church that brings the millennium. It's going to be it's not going to be exhaustive. It is not going to be, the nature of that reign is not the same as premillennialism. Yeah, so if you, in postmillennialism, it is in one sense, we talked about like leaven, how leaven in that sense works its way through the whole loaf in the way that the gospel and the church works its way throughout all of the nations and over the whole earth, but it is not working spiritually in the regeneration of every person. It's not bringing the reign and rule of Christ in perfect peace and righteousness over every person and everything. It is a leavening through the church so that the world is Christianized.
Okay, so you're saying that the world will be largely Christianized, but not everybody here is gonna be a believer.
They will not be believers, but it will also not be the, you know, the perfect, exhaustive reign of peace and righteousness on earth in the way that the premillennial solution sees these things fulfilled. So that's a difference in the nature. So you notice we can ask similar questions. Where is Christ reigning from? In whom, or what is how is this reign working? Who is bringing the reign? Those are questions that you would ask when you're trying to distinguish between the two. Well, today we're going to look at premillennialism, and here is the diagram that I'll try to do. It is more complicated. All right. Now we have seen the prefix. What does that refer to? So we had we had post, and now we have pre. What does pre refer to?
Before.
That's right. Before what?
Before.
No. It's in this case that's true, but it's in reference to the return of Christ and the millennium. All right. So the prefix is always referencing when does Christ return in relationship to the millennium coming. Thus, the alpha, the and millennialism is saying we don't need a return of Christ for the millennium. The millennium began in the first advent. So no need of a return of Christ for the millennium. The millennium is here.
Okay.
All right. Post, Jesus is coming after the millennium. The return of Christ is after the millennium.
And this is
so premillennialism tells us, when does Christ return in relationship to the millennial reign?
He comes before the millennium.
That's right. He comes before the millennium. So here's our timeline. And so we have Christ coming, and he accomplishes victory there. And this is we could call it the church age. We could call it the present age. So this is now. And in premillennialism, what we will have is, and there's two versions of premillennialism. So tonight I'm just going to start with the most basic version of premillennialism. There's going to be that what differs is the T. This T will stand for the tribulation. Between the two different types of premillennialism, the significant act or event or age that the Bible talks about, they differ on this tribulation. But the tribulation occurs, one version of premillennialism. We have the rapture occurring before the tribulation. I'm going to not do the arrows at this moment. But what we have is Christ is returning. All right, so we have Christ comes, he accomplishes the work on the cross, he ascends, and we have the present age, the church age. Christ now returns, and in the return of Christ, we have the millennial kingdom being established. The millennial kingdom being established. Now, with the return of Christ, there is a first sort of war or destruction of his enemies.
When he returns.
When he returns, yes. All right. So, and in that sense, when he returns, this millennial kingdom has Christ on earth reigning. That will come to an end. The end of the millennial kingdom comes to an end at we'll see that it's 1,000 years, or some premillennialists would not necessarily say it's 1,000 years, but it is a definitive period of time. And at the end of that 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth, there's going to be another sort of final war, Gog and Magog, and then there will be the final judgment. So I'm going to illustrate that with this bigger chair. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Hold on. Then comes the eternal state, or the new heavens and the new earth. All right. And we'll just introduce the two different versions. Where there is a difference is with what's called futuristic, or what I will call futuristic premillennialism. You will have the rapture of the church before the tribulation, so that these raptured saints in futuristic premillennialism, when Christ returns at the end of the tribulation, they will come with him. And then there is a resurrection of all the saints, as well as the saints are coming. In futuristic premillennialism, the saints return with Christ to reign with him on the earth during this period. Now, what is different at the end of that is when you have, right here, you have the resurrection of the ungodly, in addition to the judgment of unbelievers who rebel in this final war. And that is when there is the last and final judgment. So this would be the last resurrection. This is the rapture before the tribulation, and then the return with Christ. So it's like this, and then they come back down with him. So that would be sort of futuristic. So the T is between the rapture and their coming with him.
So the saints return with him
In futuristic.
For what part? The millennial kingdom?
Correct. So that's.
So there's the rapture, then the tribulation, then Christ comes back, and then the believers come back with him.
That when Christ returns at the end of the tribulation, and when he returns and establishes millennial kingdom, after he defeats the Antichrist, the beast, he will, the saints raptured will return with him in that. And they
Christ, the believers return with him.
In futuristic premillennialism. So the T is in that sense kind of in between the rapture of the saints and the ascent of the, or descent of the saints with Christ after the tribulation. In what's called classic or historic premillennialism, you don't have a rapture of the saints before the tribulation. Rather, what you have is that at the end of the tribulation, there is the first resurrection of the saints who were on earth with Christ, as well as those saints who had already died, and they would come with Christ. And so all of that happens in Christ's return, which brings the millennial kingdom. So the T, the tribulation, is before the resurrection of the saints, the transformation of the saints on earth and the ascent of the saints from heaven with Christ. So the T, the tribulation, is something that the church goes through in classic premillennialism. In futuristic premillennialism, the church does not go through the tribulation. Right? Now, but what is at least what we're talking about tonight is just this issue of the kingdom, the millennial kingdom. Now, once we get to establishing premillennialism as Jesus returns before, pre the millennium, then there's things that premillennialists have to do, wrestling with Bible passages and when do they happen, and putting the larger portrait together that give us these other ingredients that we have to add to this most simple diagram right here. Shelley.
What war destruction is that, and where does it happen? You've got it written here, but I'm not sure where it's on the timeline.
It's right before or in the work of establishing the millennial kingdom. We're going to look at that today.
So the war happens.
This one, the destruction of the enemies on earth, when Jesus returns and sets up the millennial kingdom, that act of destruction happens with his return. So this is the second advent. So the second advent of Christ brings about this destruction of his enemies, which is followed by the millennial reign of Christ with resurrected saints on the earth, which then comes to its completion with another last war and the final judgment, which then follows with the new heavens and the new earth, or the eternal state. Those are sort of synonymous things. So a lot of ingredients to this one. It's not as aesthetically simple and symmetrical as amillennialism. So it is more complicated if you like to draw it out. Jerry.
My brain starts again because of Matthew 25. And you have to do something with Matthew 25. It says that the Son of Man.
Yeah, you trying to you can't take the class. We got to do Revelation 20, and then we'll come back to that one. All right, ask the question.
25 says the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. And he will sit on his throne, glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. I'm reading this because we have to count these verses. And he will separate them from one another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on the right and the goats on the left. And then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And it ends with, after the sheep are separated from goats, 46 says, "These will go away unto eternal punishment, but the righteous unto eternal life." It makes it sound like that's it. I don't see a millennial in that verse anyway.
Yeah, well, you're going to see a millennium. But what you would have there is you'd have events that happen here and that bring forth all that follows. So, but we'll get to some of them, but it will definitely be in the new year when we can cover some of the problem passages, which are mainly Matthew 24, as well as Mark 13. Those can be more difficult for the premillennialist. But what we're going to look at today is, why do people hold to premillennialism? All right. Everyone who has to hold to a view of the millennium has to hold a view because of Revelation chapter 20. So that is what we have looked at, and we've looked at different ways that all millennialists have made interpretations of Revelation 20, different interpretations that are pretty much similar between post-millennialists and what they do with Revelation chapter 20. And so today we will continue looking at premillennialism and why Revelation 20 makes Bible interpreters come to the conclusion that premillennialism is the solution about how one should understand the future things that will bring about the last things of God's redemptive work, and the present age that brings about the age to come, which is the new heavens and the new earth. So,
The millennial, as premillennial people see it, would that be included in this age? Or the age to come? Christ is in the two ages, this age and age to come.
yeah, so I have a way of summarizing. If you're the amillennial interpretation says the present age is the millennium. Postmillennialism says the present age becomes the millennium. Premillennialism says the present age is not the millennium. Is not the millennium. No. It is an intermediate age on this earth before the new heavens and the new earth. That when you consider the church age before the return of Christ is not equated with the millennial kingdom. But the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth, that follows the millennial kingdom. So in that sense, there's going to be a distinction. But in one sense, you could say that life on the earth continues from the present age into the millennial kingdom, and then comes a new age, which is the new heavens and the new earth, or the eternal state. Now, the reason everyone has to reckon with these things is not because someone sort of cooked up like this would be a fun diagram. Amillennialism was just too easy. We need to make it more difficult. And so they said, let's create premillennialism. The reason, and it is helpful to note that premillennialism is the oldest solution of the Bible's teaching about future things. What do they disagree with?
That is, that if you go to Augustine and others,
But there were people before Augustine.
so, getting yours from the second century, that
Yeah, so if you go to before Augustine, they didn't call it premillennialism, but they were chiliasts. So they believed in a premillennial reign of Jesus, that Jesus would return and then these things promised with his reign would happen. The church fathers. So like this is you're going like 100 AD to 300, so before Origen, before Augustine.
thank you. Those people who believe in these systems is not really a result to, or the timeline of when people believe in these things. It would be the scriptures itself.
True. I would, it's just generally that people try to slander premillennialism as new, and they're only displaying their ignorance. Yeah, amillennialism, and it's if historically it's attributed in its most seed form to Origen and Augustine. So you're dealing with fourth century. So in that sense, you can say those two would be the oldest among the three, but you can't call premillennialism the Johnny come lately. Chris.
I'd just like to suggest that the material be presented first before we present arguments against it, because we haven't even heard it yet.
Yeah, yeah.
Related. So it's going to be hard and confusing for some of us to understand the arguments against something we haven't been presented. So that's what I suggest.
Yeah, and let's do that. The reason that everybody has to have a millennium, whether it's amillennialism, postmillennialism, or premillennialism, is because of Revelation 20. Not only because of Revelation 20, but because Revelation 20 refers explicitly to the millennial reign of Christ. And so all of us have to reckon with all that the Bible says about that which God will do in Jesus. And so we're going to take a look at Revelation 20. and we're going to see why is it that this passage makes one make a conclusion about the millennium, and why do premillennialists, of which I am one, say this passage in and of itself demands that I would say one believe in the pre-millennial reign of Christ. So obviously, most of my heroes don't agree with me, but I'm going to say what I think this passage really requires of us, and we'll see how much time we have to get. Probably not as far as I thought. Let's read it. Start in verse 1, Revelation chapter 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So what do we have there? Verse 2. Explicit statement of 1,000 years. Verse 3. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were finished. After these things he must be released for a short time. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their witness of Jesus and because of the word of God, and who also had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no authority, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are finished, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sits upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. Then I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books, according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every one of them according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. I believe this passage in and of itself, in conjunction with quite a bit of Old Testament passages, but I do not have time to chase them all, gives to us the necessary information in a very clear form that makes the case for the premillennial understanding of Christ's reign. So I'm going to give you the reasons that I think this passage does teach the premillennial reign of Christ, which again, it is thus Christ's returning, which then establishes his reign on earth. I do believe it is 1,000 years, though that's not necessarily essential to this position, which following this reign of Christ brings the eternal state. So first, some agreement. It is agreed upon all three of the solutions that chapter 19, starting in verse 11, through verse 21 all agree that this is the second coming of Christ. Revelation 19, verses 11 through 21, is the description of Christ's second coming. All also agree that Revelation 21 and 22 are describing to us the new heavens and the new earth. What is necessary to prove then is that if the sequence from Revelation 19 to 20 and into 21 and 22, if there is intended a linear or a chronological sequence of events, then what that would require of us to conclude is that Christ returns, establishes his kingdom rule on earth, which is said to be 1,000 years, which is then followed by the new heavens and the new earth. If that is true, if I can just establish that single point, then you would need to conclude from this passage, Revelation 20, in its place between 19 and 21, teaches Christ's return followed by a millennial kingdom. Now, I think that is what is going to happen, and we'll get into a lot of the details that are required for us to make such a conclusion. And they're going to include the following. Number one, the evidence of intended chronology in the passage of Revelation 20. Number two, the content of Revelation 20 itself. The content of Revelation 20 itself. And then number three, the consistent nature with reading Revelation 20, with reading as well Zechariah 14. So in that sense, I don't think that Revelation 20 is the only place that we see the premillennial reign of Christ, though it is the most explicit. I think it is continuing with a sequence that was given to us in the Old Testament, most clearly in the Old Testament in Zechariah 14. So there's a lot that I probably won't be able to do tonight. First, the sequence or the chronology of Revelation 20 is going to first have to hinge upon verses 1 through 3. Because we come to the conclusion of Revelation 19, where Christ returns, verse 11, and he executes a judgment. Verse 20 and verse 21, the beast is seized. Notice there's going to be a repetition of these same actions. Right? The false prophet with the beast also is seized. And notice what was happening. He was deceived by those who had received the mark of the beast, those who worshiped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. Revelation 19, verse 20. All right, so we see there the lake of fire. These two are thrown into the lake of fire. And we see that the false prophet did this as one who was deceived. Verse 21, the rest were killed with the sword, which came from the mouth of him who sits on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. This one who is on the horse is Jesus, verse 11, who was called faithful and true. He was the one on the white horse who in righteousness judges and wages war. The rest are all those besides the beast and the false prophet. So that was all those who rose up with Antichrist in opposition to the saints, which Christ returned, and here in righteousness judged and waged war. All right, so that's the second coming of Christ, where he destroys all of these enemies who raised up against him. Verse 1 in chapter 20 then begins this way. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven. Right? We have these markers that are indicating a chronological sequence of time. All right, verse 1, then I saw. Notice he's going to say this another. Verse 4, then I saw. And then when he comes down to verse 7, and when the 1,000 years were finished. And then in verse 11, then I saw. Verse 12, then I saw. Verse 14, then. All right. And then you go to Revelation 21, verse 1. What do we find? Another marker indicating a chronology in the sequence of events. Then I saw. Now, it is true, this is a vision. This is John's vision. James Hamilton describes John's vision this way: an apocalyptic prophecy in the form of a circular letter, to where the vision that John receives is a sequence of visions, and this is what he wrote down for us. But when you see these temporal markers of time, I think the burden of proof would have to say, how can you say these are not in sequence? In addition, you would have to say, well, how would we not take the markers of a chronology of events, one event following another event following another event? How would you not interpret the then I saw, and when in that way when you previously have done the same thing in the same book in Revelation? So that in verse 9, verse 19, verse 1, after these things, verse 6, then I heard, verse 11, then I saw. This is verse 17, then I saw, verse 19, then I saw. Revelation 19 is interpreted in that way, as well as the events related in Revelation 21, verse 1, verse 9, verse 6. Consistent use or interpretation of those temporal markers would say I should interpret Revelation 20 in the same way that I read and interpret Revelation 19 and Revelation 21. So this would, in one sense, if that were to decide that I view the events of Revelation 20 in a chronology or in sequence with the events of 19 and 21 and 22, it would require that you have to understand this sequence of premillennialism. All right, this is why amillennialists and postmillennialists disagree that Revelation 20 is actually continuing with events that had not yet happened. Their explanation of the events in Revelation 20 is called recapitulation. That is that they are scenes John has already seen, and now he is describing them from sort of another angle. Like the camera, instead of being this way, it's sort of like, let's rewind that event and let's move the camera and show it from this angle. That's what amillennialists and postmillennialists do in their interpretation of the events described for us in Revelation 21. But I would simply want you just to note that the markers there, the then I saw, and when, those are markers indicating sequence. They're operating according to time. Yeah, and that would be you're telling the story according to the sequence of what you saw. So, and you write that out. Uh, yeah, because we're going to see. Yeah, I would agree with you, Shelley. It does seem plain. It does seem, but there would be some reasons, and we'll get to some of them. They would describe that this these events are really describing the same event that took place in Revelation 12. All right, Revelation 12. And so there's reasons that this fails to actually explain Revelation 12 with the events of Revelation 20. It confuses what others have called superficial points of similarity as presenting the same event, and it fails to give an account for the clear differences in these two texts that necessitate understanding these as two different events. So I'm going to quickly describe the differences. In Revelation 12, the angel fell from heaven as a star, whereas in Revelation 20, verses 1 and 3, we're able to see where does the angel come down from and what does he come down as. He comes down from heaven as an angel. The angel in Revelation 12 opens the shaft of the abyss after receiving the key and released locusts to torment the wicked. Whereas Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, the angel comes down with the key to the abyss and bonds, shuts, and seals the devil in the abyss. So it's very different. Releasing locusts from the abyss is not at all the same thing as sealing the devil in the abyss. In addition, Revelation 12, Satan is cast down from earth into the abyss. I'm sorry, in Revelation 12, Satan is cast down from heaven to earth. And in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, Satan is cast from earth into the abyss. Right? These are not the same event being described. These passages are describing an opposite result from the angel's activity. In Revelation 12, Satan brings increased deception of the nations, verse 9 of chapter 12, while here in Revelation chapter 20, Satan is bound in the abyss and thus cannot deceive the nations any longer, verse 3. That's the opposite activity. These cannot describe the same event. They do not have the same results. It just doesn't make any sense to say these things are the same event being described from two different perspectives. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 12, Satan has a short amount of time, whereas in Revelation chapter 20, verse 3, Satan is said to be bound for 1,000 years. These two periods of time do not logically line up because Revelation chapter 12 casts Satan down to earth for a short period, while Satan is bound for a long time, 1,000 years in Revelation 20, verse 3. In addition, Revelation 20, if it is understood in sequence to the events of Revelation 19, these are not problems. It's a natural way of being able to see that with Jesus returning to earth, the beast, the false prophet, being cast into the lake of fire, and then Jesus killing the rest with the sword of it that comes out of his mouth, and then Satan was cast into the abyss. That sequence, that chronology of events would seem to follow in a natural way to reading the book. In addition, the lake of fire in chapter 20, verse 10, has a sensible relationship to, at least to understand the lake of fire in chapter 20, verse 10, because of we've already read about the lake of fire in verses 20 and 21. Thus, we would see that the author is writing in such a way that he's expecting his reader to perceive and understand and interpret these events in a sequence given in a chronological fashion. Add to this that when the devil is removed, there is a ceasing of his deception activity. The text is not teaching that the devil's activity stops and then he has ceased. It is his removal that ceases his activity. So these are some of the reasons that this is not the explanation of the same events that were described in Revelation chapter 20. And so I think on that level, there's problems with the recapitulation. All right. Now, there's going to be further problems with the recapitulation view. The symbolic interpretation that amillennialists and postmillennialists have with Revelation chapter 20 is they are saying that verses 1 through 3 are referring to what took place in Christ's death. That it is, when in fact it is focusing upon the stated purpose of verse 3 while ignoring the actual location of Satan's imprisonment. Satan's restriction is not determined by the stated purpose, that is, to not deceive the nations any longer. Rather, it is determined by the location of his imprisonment, that he was sealed in the abyss. It is necessary to understand the significance of what is the abyss. The abyss in the New Testament is referred to as a prison for evil spirits. You're able to see this also in verse 7. And when the 1,000 years were finished, Satan will be released from his prison. What is prison referring to? The abyss that he was sealed into. And so Luke 8 is where we read of Jesus casting the demons out of the man in whom they dwelled into a herd of pigs. And the demons said to Jesus, they did not want him to cast them where? Into the abyss. Why? Because the abyss is a prison. Right? It's not something that would refer to sort of a restriction or just sort of like a limitation of your influence. It actually is sealing one in a prison that removes the influence of the spirit who is now in the abyss. Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 3 also tell of the abyss with this same understanding that it is a prison. The total removal of the influence of the spirit since they are now imprisoned. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. It's when a demon is released from the abyss that they are now able to do their damaging work on the earth. So the significance of Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, describing Satan being cast into and sealed in the abyss, is very significant for a right understanding of what this chapter is teaching. It is not the restriction of the devil's influence upon the elect. It is ceasing the devil's influence upon the earth. That requires then an interpretation of the first 3 verses of Revelation chapter 20 as not being symbolic, as not referring to what Jesus did when he died on the cross and defeated Satan when it came to the atonement and the resurrection. This is referring to a future work that Jesus will do when he returns. Now, one of the reasons that we also conclude this to be the case is because when we look into the New Testament and we're able to read, what does the devil do right now? What is Satan doing? We do not find what Satan is doing in the world today to be equivalent terms with what Revelation chapter 20 verses 1 through 3. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4, we understand, why do people not believe the gospel? Because he is blinding them, right? The present action of the devil is actually, he's presently influencing those who hear the gospel to actually be blinded to see it and to hear it for what it is. Right? That is, yes. In 1 Peter chapter 5, he is roaming like a lion, seeking whose faith that he may devour. So these are not synonymous descriptions of the present activity of the devil. These present activities of the devil are very different from what is described in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. I think these are reasons that show that the recapitulation interpretation of Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3, it doesn't it doesn't make sense to be what it says it is. And if Revelation chapter 20 verses 1 through 3 isn't describing what Jesus accomplished in his death and resurrection, but is rather describing something that he will accomplish when he returns and establish his millennial kingdom, then we have a future expectation for these things to be accomplished after the events described in Revelation 19, when Jesus returns and destroys all of his enemies on the earth.
That say that Revelation 20 is just a retelling of another story that's already happened? Is that weird?
Yeah, they would say when it comes to the reading of the book of Revelation, they are saying that Revelation 20 is explaining the events that took place in Revelation 12, or at least some of them do. I can't speak for all of them. And so that Revelation 20 is is a description from a different angle and a different way of the events of Revelation 12. The significance of what they say is being described is what Jesus did when he died for the elect, such that in his death and resurrection, there was the purchase of all of his people, which in that sense, like Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 says, that the Father, through the Son, transferred the saints from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So, in that sense, that the rule and reign of the devil over these saints, that was utterly removed, which is true. Like these are, it's not an issue of the doctrine, it's an issue of is this passage teaching that doctrine? And so they would say this passage is teaching what God did in Jesus's first coming, the first advent, his death and resurrection, that in that he removed the reign and rule of the devil over the saints. This, they would say, is describing that. Premillennialists don't disagree with the doctrine that they are saying this passage teaches. They're disagreeing with saying this passage doesn't teach that doctrine.
Okay, I understand that. It's not that the doctrine isn't true, is that this passage is not describing that doctrine.
Correct. That's what I'm arguing. This passage is teaching, and that it is not restating the events that have occurred already in Revelation 12. Now, Revelation 20,
Then is Revelation 12 talking about?
it's not. N- 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 Yeah, well, we're not going to try to teach all of Revelation tonight. I'm just trying to get it through Revelation 20, which is not going to happen. Um, but one, what we can see with Revelation 20 is that I think there is overwhelming evidence to have to say the events of Revelation that are described in Revelation 12 are not the same as Revelation 20.
Yeah.
Right? With that being the case, there's another issue that's involved with Revelation 20, just the first three verses, but these continue. And that is the consistent interpretation of using symbolic language in Scripture, which if you take the amillennial or postmillennial interpretation, you're reading this as symbolic language. This is a description of something that is really symbolically describing what Jesus accomplished in his first advent, as opposed to what I'm going to argue and say no, that when there is a consistent application of principles for distinguishing the meaning of this language, it is not referring to that, but rather to a future work of God in Christ's second advent that brings about the binding and shutting and sealing of Satan in the abyss. no longer to have influence upon the earth for the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so here's some reasons for why I think this is the case. First, whether the 1,000 years is meant to be interpreted as literal or as in symbolic is significant, but it is, in one sense, not the main point. All right. However, if it is meant to be literal, then that would have to demand a premillennial interpretation, because essential to a spiritual interpretation, a symbolic interpretation, such as the amillennial and postmillennial interpretation, the 1,000 years must be figurative. Now, how do we know that that has to be? How many years ago did Jesus die? More than 1,000. So if this is symbolically describing what Jesus accomplished in his first advent, then there's no way that that could be referring to a literal 1,000 years, because it's been 2,000 years that the saints have been free from the reign and rule of Satan through Jesus's blood atoned for their sin and his resurrection life. And so rather, if it does aim for a literal 1,000 years, then the conclusion must be that this is referring to Jesus's return, and then establishing a 1,000-year reign where Satan is removed from influencing in the world.
Is the only way that the 1,000 years could be literal.
If the 1,000 years is intended to be a literal 1,000 years, that would remove the options of amillennialism and premillennial interpretations. I'm sorry, postmillennial interpretations. Now, it doesn't totally remove premillennialism from the option. If it's not literal, premillennialism still can be the conclusion. But if it is literal, it can only be premillennialism.
Right. But that's only if it's literal.
Yes. Now, the main reason that interpreters make a case that this is intended as a symbolic 1,000 years is because they would say the book of Revelation is a book that uses many symbolic features, especially numbers, which that is true. The book of Revelation uses 254 uses of numbers. So that's a lot. All right. But just claiming that the book uses numbers in a symbolic fashion is not presenting evidence that this particular use of a number is meant to be interpreted symbolically. There still remains the burden of proof to establish that this indeed is meant in a symbolic fashion. When you do read through the book of Revelation, you will find that there are quite a bit of numbers used in the book of Revelation that are not meant to be interpreted symbolically. And you will also find that the book of Revelation uses non-numeric references to time. We'll be able to see this even when you look at verse 3. We are able to see that verse 2 states that the Satan is bound for 1,000 years. But then look at the last sentence in verse 3. After these things, he must be released for a short time. What do we know John is able to do when it comes to referring to an undisclosed period of time?
You could use like a short time.
Without a number. Right? So the burden of proof doesn't somehow lift from the amillennial or postmillennial interpretation of this passage that interprets this as a symbolic period of time, just because the book of Revelation has numbers that are used in a symbolic way. We're going to get to that. Or at least I'm going to try to get to that. All right, John is able to distinguish undesignated periods of time in the book of Revelation. We're able to see this, as we've seen. He says, for a short time in verse 3. We also have three questions that can help us distinguish symbolic language, which would include numbers, from natural or literal language, which may also include numbers. Here are three questions. One, does it possess a degree of absurdity when it is taken literally? Right? So if it seems absurd to say 1,000 years, then you should interpret that symbolically. So if I said, son, if I have told you once, I have told you 1,000 times to put your towel in the dirty clothes. Now, you would probably think, though, I don't know, I have a 21-year-old, so maybe Bo, it's literal with you. But in that sense, you would probably think it's absurd that Will is referring to 1,000 times, and so you would be right to interpret that symbolically. But if the number actually makes sense, it's not absurd when taken in a literal fashion, then you would have to seriously consider this may be a literal use of the symbolic language, including a number. And the second question that we should ask is, no. Give me an illustration.
It says like the sands of the sea,
Hmm.
numbered like the sands of the sea, that would be absurd.
Yeah, that it seems to be an example.
Talking about to gather them, that their number is like the sand of the sea.
Yeah,
That's a,
the simile. But Mark is saying that it's subjective. I don't think it is subjective, Mark. We could maybe, I think you need to establish, like, okay, how then would you be able to somehow wipe away the principle of interpreting symbolic language when you say this is absurd, and the other person says, no, that could make sense. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that is establishing your point. I would disagree that establishes that a principle that says to hear something used symbolically that you would be able to determine it would be absurd if I interpret this literally. For you to say that's subjective, therefore I reject that principle question.
That would be absurd, right? But there's tribes out there that say, "Oh, great, a snake! I gotta have it." So I think depending on from where you come from, maybe for us both, it's difficult to have things sound absurd.
This is not the only principle for interpreting things. So there's, yeah, you would add some others like, I don't think it's shaky. You maybe could say that we can have debates over is this intended symbolically, but I don't think you can say a question that establishes if symbolic languages is when something that is literally interpreted now becomes absurd. I would say no, that's still a valid principle for trying to determine is this symbolic or is this non-symbolic language. We can disagree on the application of it, but you can't throw away the principle and call it subjective. Let me go to the next one. All right. The second question is does this symbolic language or this term that might be symbolic, does it possess a degree of clarity when taken symbolically? Interpreting 1,000 years symbolically or figuratively Does it bring more clarity? So if we say 1,000 years is interpreted literally, all right, that seems clear. But you would ask the question, I should wonder if I take this symbolically, does it give greater clarity to what it is trying to communicate? If greater clarity comes from a symbolic interpretation, then that would give us reason to interpret this symbolically. Right, give an illustration. B.B. Warfield interprets the 1,000 years. B.B. Warfield is a postmillennialist. He interprets this passage, this 1,000 years, to mean complete. It refers to completion. And this is his explanation. Quote, the sacred number seven, in combination with the equally sacred number three, forms the number of holy perfection 10. And when this 10 is cubed into 1,000, John has said that he is conveying to our minds the idea of absolute completeness. Now, I am in no way someone who could argue as a peer or a person of equal intellect with B.B. Warfield, but this does not seem to give more clarity to me. This seems to make it more complicated to. And all right, so all right, if you somehow are reading Revelation 20 and you read verse 20 in the context of Revelation and you are persuaded that, yep, that makes sense, um, uh, in chapter 2, I mean, in verse 2, and he bound him for 1,000 years, and you thought, I think that is what 1,000 years mean. Um, then may you be blessed. May your heart be warmed. True, true. But the principles of trying to figure out is this number symbolic or not remain the same. All right. I think there is a debate that we can have as to say, does this bring clarity or does this bring complexity? That is not subjective, nor is it in one sense just decided because you feel that way. Make your argument for how this brings clarity or how it brings complexity, and then let those arguments sort of go with one another. But if you would argue that I think that a complicated math equation somehow brings brings clarity to 1,000 years, I'm not at all persuaded by your argument. Yeah. 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 Like, did that cross your mind?
I mean, that's not a hermeneutic, that's not a good hermeneutic.
All right, let's go on. There's the third question. If you guys stumble over those two, I'll be honest. Like, I don't, Tim, you're going to teach the hermeneutic class in this church. Here's the third question. Does it fall into an established category of symbolic language? Figures of speech are legitimate departures from the normal use of language. They are limited in number and can be defined in accordance with known examples. If there is a figure of speech of non-literal genre, that 1,000 years, it would be hyperbole. But if this were the intent and the recapitulation view is taken, then it would be turned on its head. How hyperbolic is a period of time that is now one half of the literal years since the kingdom began? All right. Um, if you have here's the third question. The third question that we ask is, does this figure of speech that we're wondering, is it symbolic or is it literal? Does it fall into an established category of symbolic language? Like if I said it's raining cats and dogs, do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah,
Why?
because we use that picture.
Yeah, because you have a list in your mind of used figurative language.
Right.
And you make reference back to it, at least in this third question, you make reference back to a known list of symbolic, language that you are able to then interpret symbolically and understand what the meaning is. Right? So if you're going to say the 1,000 years is symbolic and you're going to use the third question as the basis for your interpretation, this is symbolic because 1,000 years is a part of this sort of list of known symbolic phrases that we are able to refer to. Then what you're saying is 1,000 years is hyperbolic, right? If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. That's hyperbole, right? I'm overstating something when in fact I'm not trying to, I'm just told you many times. I'm being hyperbolic in my figurative language to make my point. How long has Christ been in heaven? 2,000 years. Would 1,000 years be hyperbolic then? Because he's been in heaven for twice the amount of time as 1,000 years. So if I were going to use hyperbole to my son to say, son, if I've told you once, I've told you 1.5 times. Pick your towel up and put it in dirty clothes.
On 1,000 mils. Is that an example?
That would be. But it would also, I think, merit question, since Jesus has been in heaven for over twice this amount, is this hyperbolic? I think at least these are three questions to use for you and I to judge. Is this literal? Now, I'll be honest and say, I think it's literal, but it doesn't really matter that much to me if it is.
Is the thousand, the count on 1,000 mils? But I thought that was figurative.
No, I think that's figurative. Um,
Be figurative, but it's not in this. Is that what you're saying?
I think these three questions are what we are helpful questions to make us wrestle with. Is the 1,000 years literal? Presently today, I think it is literal. At the same time, I think it might not be, right? But at least you're having to wrestle with the questions that this is not only having to deal with the 1,000 years, but also this symbolic interpretation of Revelation 1 through 3 is that Satan being thrown into the abyss is symbolic. The key is symbolic, the angel is symbolic, the abyss is symbolic, Satan being bound and shut and sealed is symbolic. His his being kept from deceiving the nations is symbolic. So it's not just referring in these three verses to 1,000 years. That's just one of the things that we would have to wrestle with. It's having to refer to, in that sense, the main teaching points of Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. So these three questions are what we would have to apply in trying to seek to understand what is being taught here. So I do think that when we wrestle with these questions, we would have to understand there is symbolic language, and we've only made it through the first three verses of Revelation 20. There is symbolic language, all right? The chain. I don't think Satan actually, in this period, is going to be restrained to the abyss, because literally there is a chain that is holding and the devil, who is an angel, in the abyss. Right? That doesn't make any sense for the same, if we use the same three questions that I just gave to you and wrestling with, so is there a literal chain? But just because one part of Revelation 20 is symbolic, does that mean that all of Revelation 20 is symbolic? No. In the same way that I would say, is it raining cats and dogs? And you interpret, well, he's not literally referring to cats and dogs falling out of the sky, so he must not be referring to literal rain. And in that way, I think we are able to say that we work through this, and there are parts of it that are indeed understood rightly to be symbolic, while others of it I do not think make any sense to interpret them symbolic. And so here we are able to see that when we see what Satan in the New Testament is told to do, in 2 Corinthians 4:4, he keeps unbelievers from seeing the gospel and believing on Christ. 2 Timothy 2, verse 26, he traps and holds captive unbelievers so that they cannot be loosed from his will. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 3, he attempts to lead churches away from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. In Revelation 12:9, he was attributed as the being who deceived the whole world. In Revelation 13, verse 14, he was deceiving those in the tribulation through his works in the beast and his image. And here it says that he is bound and shut and sealed into an abyss, so that he is not able to deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years was finished. That removal of Satan's influence upon the earth does not make sense if it is interpreted symbolically. And so I think that this, we only made it through the first three verses. Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, teaches us explicitly that the next sequence in the series of events after Jesus returns and destroys his enemies is that Satan is brought into the abyss for a 1,000-year period, which ceases his influence upon the earth. It doesn't make interpretive sense if, one, we go back to Revelation 12 and say this is the same activity, and it also doesn't make sense to interpret this symbolically as just Jesus's effective redemption of the saints through what he achieved in his first advent. I therefore present to you the reasons why I, at least, am persuaded from just these three verses, but we'll continue through the rest of it next year, that Christ returns, and for these 1,000 years, with the removal of Satan's influence, reigns on earth with his saints. Right? So I think just the first three verses already tip us over into premillennialism, but I think the rest of the chapter will continue to do the same. Tim, you've had your hand up, and I have kept going, so I want to. Okay, you're making a distinction between physical and literal. Hmm. Yeah. Which the abyss, which is a prison, would have to be an actual thing. Um, well, one thing that is clear is I'm going to kind of be revved up. And I'll probably be revved up for two reasons. One, I do believe this. And two, this is a point of argument. And so if you disagree with me, please don't think that I'm revved up with you. And if you are not persuaded, please don't think that I think less of you. I'm sure you'll probably think less of me. But this should also be one of the areas that I think Christians can and even should rightly debate. And so I'm going to at least give to you why I think Revelation 20 should lead you to be a premillennial. So, Jerry.
Christians should debate. I don't think there's going to debate tonight, Brother Christian.
Well, I mean, yeah.
And the other thing I would say is the best way to really examine this, and I love my brothers, I don't care what they are, premillennial, postmillennial, or dispensational. Uh, that it's a good thing to do the research yourself, to read people other than pre or post, read all of these guys, listen to them. Some of them you can hear on YouTube and hear their arguments. You can buy their books and read some of the things in detail that they say about these things. Uh, and so I would make that comment. And the other comment, by the way, I've stopped being a dispensationalist, which is the way I was raised. When I started really reading in Schofield, some of the things he said that was going to happen in the millennium. And I hope at some point you describe the millennial, what's going to be going, who's going to be there, how it's going to operate, all these sinful people in Christ's presence. If you would discuss that, that would be good. And one other observation I had tonight is that we, in this church, at some point, we should have the book of Revelation taught, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, the way we do other scripture.
It will be eventually. We'll see when Tim wants to teach it. So one, I would say, Jerry, there is a debate. There's always a debate. You can listen to it, when every pastor teaches or preaches, he should teach his position and he should try to persuade. These are the arguments for these interpretations. And then you'd hear another pastor who holds to another position and they'll give you, these are the reasons for my interpretation. And so I'll just go ahead and tell you, if you want to read what I think is the best argument for an all-millennial interpretation, you should read G.K. Beale. I don't think anybody's going to be better than G.K. Beale. But at the same time, I would say I am unpersuaded. So that's how it works. But in that way, the church debates. There is a debate. There is an argument of interpretation on the basis of these are the reasons for that. These are the reasons I reject this. And in that, the church is debating. Yeah, and Riddleberger himself says that the significance of Revelation 20 is that this is the chapter that decides where you are on it. So all millennialists will say the same thing that I am saying. How you read Revelation 20 is going to put you into one of the eschatological solutions. And so Revelation 20 is the key text. I thought we might get into Zechariah 14. I encourage you to read it, and there you will see a similar sequence that there's an establishment of the reign, all right? Then there is a rebellion, and then it is brought to a cessation. So, in that sense, this is not a new sequence. Zechariah 14 has the same sequence. So, but it's gone a long time. So, y'all are dismissed. Mark, I'll take your question afterwards. Thanks for your encouragement. Y'all are dismissed.